She was tossed into the freezing rain with nothing but the clothes on her back and a deed to a worthless, collapsed church. But her greedy step-family made one fatal mistake they didn't know. The ruin sat on a forgotten crypt, hiding one of history's greatest lost royal fortunes. The heavy oak doors of the Holloway Manor slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through the freezing Surrey rain. Beatrice Holloway stood on the wet gravel driveway, her thin trench coat soaked through, staring at the imposing estate that had been her home for 26 years. On the portico, her stepmother Caroline stood flanked by Beatrice's smug stepbrother Pierce. Caroline adjusted her designer silk scarf, her expression a mask of cold, calculated triumph. Pierce simply smirked, tossing a single cardboard box onto the muddy gravel. It contained the only things Beatrice was allowed to keep: a few faded photographs of her late biological mother and a battered leather journal. "Don't come back, Beatrice." Caroline's voice cut through the sound of the pouring rain, sharp and devoid of any human warmth. "The estate security has your photograph. If you set foot on the grounds of Holloway Industries or this property again, you will be arrested for trespassing." Beatrice didn't scream. She didn't cry. The shock of her father's sudden, massive heart attack just 48 hours prior had left her entirely hollowed out. But the second blow, the reading of the will that morning at the prestigious London offices of Clifford Chance, had been the killing strike. Her father, Richard Holloway, had been a titan in British real estate, a man whose portfolio was managed by Coutts & Co., and whose assets numbered in the hundreds of millions. Beatrice had worked by his side for 5 years, managing the philanthropic wing of the company, believing she was being groomed to take over. But the document presented by the stony-faced solicitors had been entirely rewritten 3 weeks before his death. The revised will left the company the liquid assets, the stock portfolios, and the Surrey estate entirely to Caroline and Pierce. Beatrice was left with a single insulting line item. "To my daughter Beatrice, I leave the deed to St. Jude's of the Wolds and the absolute certainty that she will know what to do with it." When Beatrice had asked the solicitor what St. Jude's of the Wolds was, Pierce had laughed out loud. It was a decommissioned, collapsed 14th century church in the desolate moors of North Yorkshire. The roof had caved in a century ago. The land was unzoned, entirely protected by historical preservation laws that prevented it from being developed, making it a financial black hole. It was essentially a pile of worthless rocks. Shivering in the cold, Beatrice picked up the sodden cardboard box and walked the 2 miles to the local train station. Her bank accounts had been frozen, her company credit cards deactivated. She had exactly £240 in her personal checking account. She was utterly destitute. 2 days later, Beatrice stood in front of St. Jude's of the Wolds. The reality of her inheritance was even bleaker than the solicitors had described. Set against a backdrop of grey, unforgiving Yorkshire sky, the church was a skeletal ruin. The nave was a jagged crown of crumbling stone, choked by decades of aggressive ivy. The stained glass windows were long gone, replaced by the howling wind that whistled through the empty arches. The only portion of the structure that remained somewhat intact was the heavy stone vestry at the rear, though its wooden door was rotting off its iron hinges. Beatrice dropped her duffel bag on the overgrown grass, fighting back a wave of crushing despair. Why would her father buy this? Richard Holloway was a ruthless, calculating businessman. He didn't buy useless land. He didn't make sentimental purchases. Every acquisition had a purpose, a hidden angle, a massive return on investment. Seeking shelter from a sudden drizzle, Beatrice forced her way into the vestry. It smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. She sat on a fallen stone pillar, exhausted, starving and entirely alone. It was then she remembered the battered leather journal her father had kept. Pierce had thrown it out thinking it was trash. Beatrice pulled it from her bag. The pages were mostly filled with her father's erratic handwriting, documenting endless meetings with contractors and local politicians. But as she flipped toward the back, the business notes stopped abruptly. In their place were detailed hand-drawn architectural sketches of arches and columns. Beatrice's brow furrowed. They were sketches of St. Jude's. Tucked into the very last page of the journal was a folded piece of heavy parchment. Beatrice carefully opened it. It was a receipt from Sotheby's dated 6 months ago for the private purchase of a document labelled the Cromwell Inventory, 1536. Beneath the receipt, her father had scrawled a single frantic sentence. In red ink, the history books are lying. The dissolution didn't destroy it. The monks of St. Jude's didn't burn the Queen's dowry. They buried it. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat. The dissolution of the monasteries was King Henry VIII's ruthless campaign to disband Catholic monasteries and confiscate their immense wealth. Millions of pounds of gold, silver, and priceless relics had been seized by the crown, but historical legend had always whispered of certain monastic orders that had rebelled, hiding their vast treasures deep underground before the king's men arrived. She looked up her eyes, scanning the cracked stone floor of the vestry. She wasn't just standing in a collapsed church. She was standing on top of her father's final, greatest secret. The rain intensified, hammering against the remaining slate tiles of the vestry roof, but Beatrice hardly noticed the cold. Adrenaline surged through her veins, a fiery contrast to the freezing Yorkshire air. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had given her the ultimate puzzle, one he had been murdered for. The thought chilled her. Richard's heart attack had been sudden, and Caroline had ordered him cremated within 24 hours, completely bypassing an autopsy. The timing of the rewritten will, the rushed funeral, the immediate eviction. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple family betrayal. Before Beatrice could process the dark implications, the roar of a heavy engine shattered the quiet isolation of the moors. A sleek black Range Rover crawled up the muddy, unpaved lane leading to the ruins, its headlights slicing through the gloom. The vehicle stopped, and a man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of the muddy ruins. He carried a large black umbrella and walked with the unhurried confidence of a predator. Beatrice stepped out of the vestry, her muscles tensing. "Miss Holloway, I presume," the man called out, flashing a perfectly white, utterly insincere smile. "I'm Alistair Covington, CEO of Covington Heritage Group. Your late father and I were acquaintances." Beatrice crossed her arms, shivering but refusing to show weakness. "What do you want, Mr. Covington?" Covington stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the mud. "I'll get straight to the point. I represent a private consortium that purchases historic English ruins for preservation. I offered your father a substantial sum for this parcel of land shortly before his unfortunate passing. He was stubborn, but seeing as you are currently—" He paused, his eyes sweeping over her damp clothes and the duffel bag inside the vestry. "Experiencing a transition in your lifestyle, I am prepared to offer you £50,000 for the deed. Today. The funds will be wired into your account via Barclays within the hour. £50,000. To a woman with £200 to her name, it was a lifeline. It was a warm bed food and a fresh start. But Beatrice was Richard Holloway's daughter. She recognized a desperate buyer when she saw one. Covington's eyes were entirely too sharp, his posture too rigid. He didn't want to preserve this church. He wanted what was underneath it. "The property isn't for sale," Beatrice said, her voice steady. Covington's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Miss Holloway, let us not play games. You have been disinherited. You have nothing. This land is a hazard. If you refuse, my associates on the local zoning board will declare this structure an imminent public danger. The county will seize it under eminent domain, and you will get absolutely nothing. Take the money." "Get off my property," Beatrice demanded, stepping forward. Covington held her gaze for a long, menacing moment. "Your father was a foolish man at the end of his life, Beatrice. It seems arrogance runs in the blood. I will be back, and the offer will not be as generous." He turned, climbed back into the Range Rover, and sped away the tires, kicking up a spray of dark mud. Beatrice ran back into the vestry, her heart pounding against her ribs. Covington's appearance confirmed everything. Her father was close to finding it, and Carolyn must have struck a deal with Covington to get the estate in exchange for handing over the ruins. But her father had outsmarted them both by leaving the deed directly to Beatrice. Time was running out. She grabbed a heavy iron crowbar she had found in the trunk of her car and the flashlight from her emergency kit. She opened her father's journal again, shining the beam onto the sketches. 3 paces north from the high altar. Look for the bleeding rose. Beatrice stepped out into the nave, the rain soaking her hair. She located the raised stone dais where the high altar had once stood, now covered in moss and dead vines. She placed her boots against the edge of the dais and took 3 deliberate paces north. She dropped to her knees, tearing at the thick, wet sod with her bare hands. Mud caked under her fingernails as she ripped away centuries of overgrowth. Her fingers hit solid, cold stone. She frantically brushed away the dirt, revealing a massive rectangular granite slab. Carved into the center of the stone, faintly visible beneath the grime of 500 years, was a Tudor rose, but it was bisected by a deep, jagged slash. The bleeding rose. There was a rusted iron ring set into the top of the slab. Beatrice hooked the claw of the crowbar through the ring and heaved. Her muscles screamed in protest, the heavy iron biting into her palms. For an agonizing minute, nothing happened. Then, with a sickening crack of breaking mortar, the stone shifted. A rush of stale, freezing air blasted upward, carrying the distinct metallic scent of ancient dust. Beatrice pushed the slab completely aside, revealing a narrow, spiraling stone staircase descending into absolute, suffocating darkness. Swallowing her fear, she clicked on her flashlight and began the descent. The stairs were slick with moisture. The silence down here was absolute, heavy enough to crush the breath from her lungs. At the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight beam swept across a massive cavern. It was a crypt, but it wasn't a burial place for local parishioners. Lined along the walls were heavy lead-lined coffins, but they were devoid of any religious markings or names. She approached the central tomb. Unlike the others, it was wrapped in thick, forged iron chains, secured by a massive, complex padlock that looked terrifyingly modern compared to the stone around it. Beatrice looked at the lock, her pulse hammering. The keyhole was abnormally shaped, a wide cross with a notched bottom. Trembling, she reached into her pocket. Earlier that morning, buried at the bottom of the cardboard box Pierce had thrown at her, she had found an old, heavy iron key belonging to her father. She slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a loud, echoing click, the lock disengaged. Beatrice unwound the heavy chains, letting them crash to the stone floor. She pushed the heavy lid of the tomb back. It slid with a heavy, grinding groan. She shined her flashlight inside, expecting to see bones. Instead, the light hit something so bright, so violently reflective, she had to squint. The tomb was entirely filled with gold. Neatly stacked rows of solid gold ingots, each stamped with the royal seal of King Edward III. Resting on top of the bullion were velvet sacks, rotting away to reveal cascades of cut sapphires, rubies the size of quail eggs, and a solid gold chalice encrusted with diamonds. It wasn't just a fortune. It was a king's ransom, hidden in the dark since 1536. Beatrice reached out her trembling fingers, brushing the cold, heavy surface of a gold bar. Her life of poverty was over. She held the power to destroy Carolyn and Pierce. But then a sound shattered the silence of the crypt. It was the distinct heavy thud of footsteps on the stone floor of the church above, and then the echo of a man's voice drifting down the stairwell. "Fan out. If she's here, find her. And don't worry about being gentle." Covington hadn't left. He had come back with his men, and Beatrice was trapped underground with $1 billion secret. The beam of Beatrice's flashlight snapped off, plunging the subterranean vault into absolute, crushing darkness. Her breathing sounded impossibly loud in her own ears, a frantic rhythm of pure terror. Above her, the heavy boots of Alistair Covington's men struck the ancient stone of the vestry floor. The sound was accompanied by the harsh scrape of metal. They were clearing the debris away from the concealed stairwell. "The slab is moved!" A gruff voice echoed down the spiraling shaft. "Boss, she found it. The entrance is open." Beatrice pressed her back against the freezing, damp stone wall of the crypt, her mind racing. She was cornered in a dead end, hundreds of feet below the desolate Yorkshire moors, with men who clearly intended to bury her alongside the Tudor gold. She clamped a dirt-streaked hand over her mouth, forcing her breathing to slow. The narrow beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight suddenly pierced the gloom of the stairwell, sweeping slowly across the stone steps. They were descending. Desperation fueled her next move. Beatrice dropped to her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing at her skin, and crawled blindly toward the perimeter of the vault. Her father's journal had contained detailed sketches, but she hadn't had time to study the full architectural layout. Historically monastic vaults, especially those built to hide royal dowries from the crown's inquisitors, were never designed with only a single point of entry. A dead end meant certain death for the monks protecting the hoard. There had to be an egress tunnel. Her fingers traced the base of the heavy lead-lined coffins that lined the eastern wall. The first two were immovable, cemented firmly into the floor. The flashlight beam from the stairs grew brighter. She could hear the distinct metallic click of a firearm being racked. "Fan out!" Covington's voice drifted down, smoother and deadlier than before. "She has nowhere to go. Check behind the pillars." Beatrice reached the third coffin. Unlike the others, the mortar around its base felt loose, crumbling away to reveal a deep, deliberate gap. She braced her boots against the wall and pushed against the side of the heavy sarcophagus with every ounce of strength her exhausted body could muster. For a terrifying second, it didn't budge. Then, with a harsh, grating scrape that sounded deafening in the enclosed space, the coffin pivoted on a concealed iron axis. Behind it lay a jagged hole in the masonry, barely wide enough for a human body leading into a pitch-black earthen tunnel. Without hesitating, Beatrice squeezed herself into the narrow opening, pulling the heavy coffin back into place, just as the crypt was flooded with blinding, harsh halogen light. She lay on her stomach in the claustrophobic dirt tunnel, breathless and trembling, peering through a tiny crack in the stone. Below, Covington stepped off the final stair, his expensive charcoal suit starkly out of place in the ancient catacomb. Two heavily armed men flanked him. Covington's eyes immediately locked onto the central tomb. The heavy iron lid sat pushed aside. He walked slowly toward it, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel. When he looked inside, the cold, calculating CEO facade completely shattered. A look of sheer, unadulterated greed washed over his face. The ambient light from the flashlights caught the massive pile of King Edward III's solid gold ingots and the cascading sapphires painting the stone vault in a glittering, fiery glow. "My God," one of the armed men whispered, lowering his weapon. "It's real. The Holloway old man wasn't crazy." "Of course it's real," Covington murmured, reaching down to pull a heavy diamond-encrusted chalice from the pile. He held it up, mesmerized. £1 billion in unregistered, untraceable antiquities, the greatest off-the-books asset in European history. He turned to his men, his eyes hardening. "But where is the girl?" "She must have slipped past us outside Mr. Covington. The vault is empty." Covington's jaw tightened. She didn't slip past us. She is on foot in the middle of nowhere with no money and no phone. Find her. If she gets to the local constabulary, this entire operation is compromised. I don't care what you have to do to make it look like an accident. The moors are treacherous. People fall into ravines every day. Behind the wall, Beatrice's blood ran ice cold. It wasn't just a threat. It was a confession to her father's murder. They had made his death look like a sudden heart attack, an unfortunate accident of biology just to seize control of this property. But as Covington turned away from the tomb, Beatrice noticed something else, something that made her heart stop. Covington pulled a sleek smartphone from his breast pocket and dialed a number. The Crypt's acoustics amplified his end of the conversation perfectly. "It's me," Covington said smoothly. "We've secured the primary asset. Yes, the vault was exactly where Richard said it would be. The bullion is immaculate." He paused, listening. "No, the daughter is a minor complication. My men are handling it as we speak. Get up here to St. Jude's immediately and bring the offshore holding contracts. We celebrate tonight, darling." Darling. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut as the ultimate betrayal slammed into her. Covington wasn't just a rogue competitor. He was working directly with Caroline. Her stepmother had seduced Covington, orchestrated Richard Holloway's murder, manipulated the will and kicked Beatrice out into the street, all to lay claim to a hidden royal fortune, fury hotter and sharper than the fear ignited in Beatrice's chest. She backed slowly away from the crack, navigating the suffocating darkness of the escape tunnel. It angled sharply upward, the air growing colder and fresher with every agonizing yard. She crawled for what felt like hours, her hands bruised and bleeding, until her fingers finally broke through a thick lattice of dead ivy and wet soil. She tumbled out into the freezing Yorkshire night, collapsing into a muddy ditch roughly a quarter-mile from the ruins of St. Jude's. She looked back. The silhouettes of Covington's men were sweeping the moors with powerful searchlights. Beatrice wiped the mud from her eyes, her resolve solidifying into something entirely unbreakable. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to destroy them. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, chilling fog rolling over the desolate moors. Beatrice stayed low, utilizing the natural dips in the terrain to evade the sweeping searchlights. She ran blindly through the wet heather for nearly an hour, until the faint yellow glow of a roadside pub appeared through the mist. It was the Black Dog, a dilapidated tavern catering to passing lorry drivers and local sheep farmers. She burst through the heavy wooden door looking like a drowned ghost. She was coated in thick black mud, her hands bleeding, her trench coat torn to shreds. The few patrons at the bar went completely silent. "I need to use your phone," Beatrice gasped, bracing herself against the scarred wooden bar. "Now! It's an absolute emergency." The burly bartender, taking one look at her wild, desperate eyes, wordlessly slid a landline across the counter. Beatrice snatched the receiver. She didn't dial the local police. Covington had already bragged about owning the local zoning board. It was highly likely his payroll extended to the county constabulary. She needed a federal hammer. She needed the one man her father had explicitly warned her never to call, unless it was a matter of life and death. She dialed the direct London line of Detective Inspector Graham Fowler, the notoriously ruthless head of Scotland Yard's Art and Antiquities Squad. "Fowler," a gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Inspector, my name is Beatrice Holloway, daughter of Richard Holloway." Beatrice said, her voice shaking but rapidly gaining strength. "I am standing at a pub in North Yorkshire, and I have hard evidence regarding a conspiracy to fence over £1 billion of stolen 16th century royal gold and the murder of my father." There was a profound silence on the other end. Then Fowler's voice dropped an octave. "Where exactly are you, Miss Holloway? Do not move." For the next 4 hours, Beatrice waited in the back office of the pub, nursing a cup of scalding tea provided by the bartender. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting the gloomy sky in streaks of bruised purple when a fleet of unmarked black tactical vehicles violently crunched into the pub's gravel parking lot. Inspector Fowler, a tall, imposing man with sharp grey eyes, marched inside. Beatrice quickly relayed everything: the rewritten will, the journal, the bleeding, Rose, the Crypt, Covington's confession, and Caroline's imminent arrival to secure the offshore contracts. Fowler didn't waste a single second. Right, we take them in the act. Back at the ruins of St. Jude's, Alistair Covington was orchestrating the removal of the first batch of gold ingots. A heavy-duty flatbed truck had been backed up to the vestry doors. Standing beside him, shielded by an expensive black umbrella, was Caroline. She was dressed in immaculate cashmere, completely unfazed by the mud, staring at the gleaming gold with an expression of sheer avarice. "I told you Richard was hiding something monumental," Caroline purred, linking her arm through Covington's. "Getting rid of him and the brat was the smartest thing we ever did." "The brat is still missing," Covington muttered, checking his watch. "But she won't survive the elements much longer. She won't have to—" A loud, amplified voice suddenly boomed across the ruins. Caroline and Covington spun around in horror. Surrounding the perimeter of the collapsed church, heavily armed officers from Scotland Yard stepped out from the morning fog. Red and blue strobe lights from hidden police cruisers violently illuminated the stone walls. "Alistair Covington and Caroline Holloway, you are surrounded," Inspector Fowler declared over the megaphone, stepping forward with his badge raised. "Put your hands on your heads and step away from the vehicle." Covington froze his face, draining of all color. Caroline shrieked, dropping her designer handbag into the mud as two officers aggressively pinned Covington against the side of the flatbed, snapping heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. From behind the barricade of police vehicles, Beatrice stepped forward. She had washed her face and borrowed a dry fleece jacket, but she still looked like a warrior who had just walked through hell. She walked slowly toward the vestry, stopping just a few feet from her stepmother. Caroline's eyes widened in absolute shock and terror. "Beatrice, how?" "You forgot one critical thing about my father." "Caroline," Beatrice said, her voice echoing clearly over the moaning wind. "He built an empire because he always planned 3 steps ahead. And you forgot one thing about me. I'm his daughter." "Please," Caroline begged, her flawless facade crumbling into pathetic sobs as an officer grabbed her arm. "Beatrice, I'm family. We can share it." "You're not family. You're a trespasser," Beatrice replied coldly, turning her back on the weeping woman. "Get her off my property." 3 months later, the doors of the newly established Holloway Foundation opened to the global press. Beatrice, dressed in a sharp-tailored executive suit, stood at the podium in front of the heavily fortified, beautifully restored St. Jude's Cathedral. The Crown had claimed the gold as was customary under British law, but Beatrice's brilliant legal maneuvering and her critical role in exposing a massive criminal enterprise had secured her a historic finder's fee of 12%. It was a sum that far exceeded her father's original liquid wealth. Carolyn and Pierce were facing life in prison for conspiracy and murder, leaving Beatrice as the sole undisputed heir to Holloway Industries. She looked out at the flashing cameras, a calm, victorious smile on her face. She had been thrown to the wolves with nothing but a cardboard box and a ruined church, but she had returned, leading the pack. If this dramatic tale of betrayal, hidden history, and ultimate revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible story of Beatrice's triumph with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life mysteries and astonishing hidden treasure sagas. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a plot twist.